Hey guys, it's me again, Danny. In the last video, we took a deep dive into a pretty interesting distortion plugin called Cyberdrive. The link to the part 1 is in the description. There we broke down the entire classic module, what it's made of, what it emulates, and so on. In this video, we'll be talking about the amps, the pedals, and we'll find out if this plugin can actually compete with FabFilter Saturn. Let's roll! Let's dive into the amps module. I'm not sure this plugin is a good investment for guitar tones, at least not for high gain. Just look what happens when I crank the gain on any of these amps. Purple is the highest gain amp here, and on guitar it sounds just awful. Take a listen. But for bass guitar, it's actually a pretty solid tool. Now let's hear what this thing can do on bass. All tests are done with the cab from Hammer. Now these three sound really good, and I'd personally pick them if I had to choose between Saturn and Cyberdrive. The others, well, depends on your taste. Let's quickly go through the most important pedals. Overall, the character of the classic pedals inside this plugin is pretty specific, and if your usual VST pedals don't work with some problematic source material, it might be worth trying this. Their overall vibe is quite mid-focused, like there is a built-in low-pass filter on all of them. Let's start with the Rat, of course on bass. Classic setup with a high-pass filter at 300 Hz before the pedal. I won't be adding back the low end for now, so you can clearly hear the distortion character. So yeah, like I said, the Rat in Cyberdrive is more mid-focused compared to the others. On some sources, it'll work better and sit tighter in the mix, but personally, I still prefer the Rat from Nembrini. Tube Screamer works completely different. Definitely doesn't sound like the classic green pedal. Again, more mid-heavy, but not in the typical green way, and less bright overall. Make your own conclusions. Klon-style, that's one of my favorite pedals for tightening up high-gain guitars, along with Timmy and maybe OCD. It pulls the sound together, cuts the lows just enough for me, but does it without being destructive. Unlike the Tube Screamer, which for me just reshapes the mids and often changes the whole character of the amp. Here's how the Klon is implemented in the Cyberdrive. Again, doesn't really sound like the canonical Klon. I haven't tried the actual pedal though. No wonder with those insane prices, right? But all the emulations I've used don't sound like what I hear in Cyberdrive. Still, once you run it into an amp, it can give some pretty interesting results. So here we are at the most interesting question. Can this desert island distortion plugin really compete with Saturn 2? Here are the main differences between the two. Saturn doesn't have a pedal module at all. Saturn automatically puts a cab on amps. Cyberdrive doesn't. That's convenient in some cases, but in Cyberdrive you also can't bypass the DI signal without the cab, because the cab is tied to the plugin's global output, not to the amp module itself. Band splitting is quicker and more intuitive in Saturn. On the other hand, Cyber lets you stack up to 3 distortions in series inside the plugin. Cyberdrive also has extra effects down at the bottom. Let me show you. But honestly, I find them pretty average quality and almost never use them. If we compare the tape and tube, in Saturn they can be clearly more subtle. Plus Saturn lets you pick from several variations, while Cyber gives you just one. Saturn also has a transformer mode that Cyber doesn't. Let me show you what it does on drums, for example. Of course, it'll sound different depending on the source. Cyberdrive, however, has way more classic saturation flavors that Saturn doesn't offer. Which of these you actually need, that's up to you. And let's also compare the Fender-style emulations on bass. Judging by user tests and some hints in the manual, American Silver and American Cream are the closest to a Fender Bassman, a historic bass amp that later became a guitar standard. As I said earlier in this video, for bass distortion overall, my personal vote goes for Cyberdrive. There is also a module called Shape, basically exaggerated waveform experiments, with no hardware equivalent. But for example, you can actually get some pretty fun high gain out of square push on the upper part of bass tone. Well, overall this is a pretty interesting plugin. A lot of things are done well, or at least even if they don't sound like the original hardware, they are still useful as an alternative for unusual sources. Personally, it found its place for me as a saturator, and I do use it. But honestly, more than half of the functions in here are completely useless for me, starting from the creative distortions and ending with stuff like built-in compressor and reverb down at the bottom section. If you are into sound design though, I think this plugin will be way more valuable for you. Can it compete with Saturn? That's for you to decide, but if you can grab it on a discount, I'd call it a decent investment. Okay guys, that's finally it for this video. Don't forget there's a part 1 of this review out there. As always, like if you found it useful, subscribe if you want to, and see you next time.